Hello. So today I thought I would finally film my summary of 2019 because, well, the year is over. It's 2020 now. And I've got a bunch of data recorded to the best of my ability. Plus I've answered some questions about what my favorite, least favorite, etc. books were. And then I want to talk a little bit about 2020 goals, but we'll get to that. Let's start with 2019. So 2019, I, at the end of the year, collected all of this data. So it might not be 100% accurate because there are a few things I just might not remember super well. This year I'm gonna try and record like this data as I read so that I don't have to go back and try and remember certain things about the books. So first of all, I collected data as to whether the books I wrote were by men or women. Just like last year, we're going off of my assumptions based on people's names and what little I know about them, and we're just disregarding the existence of anything beyond the gender binary because God forbid, but it's easier this way. And yeah, so, oh, I guess I should say also, in total I read, I think it was 54 books. It seems like the kind of thing I probably should have looked up before I came down here to film this, but I didn't. I think it was 54 books. Okay, so 38 books were by men and 16 books were by women. And I think those are all different individual books because this year I don't think I read any short story collections that had short stories by multiple people. So like I didn't read any anthologies. I just read a couple of short story collections by singular authors. But anyway, I did read some books by more than one person. I do not count those people separately. So counting men and women here, I am counting the books themselves, not the authors, which means authors get repeated, which means James S.A. Corey accounts for, I think, 6 of these marks. Okay, so then as far as topics of what the books were, we have 10 nonfiction, which is, I think, less than last year. Yeah, it's less than last year by a little bit. 20 science fiction books, which is more than last year. Last year I actually had nonfiction and science fiction were equal. This year I read more science fiction, probably at least partially because of The Expanse. 5 fantasy books, 9 books that I could count under mystery or thriller, 9 books that were historical fiction, and 1 contemporary. So all of that's fairly consistent. The numbers are almost all bigger than what I read last year because I just read like fucking 12 more books this year or something. I don't know what happened, but it was wild. I also decided it would be fun to do something I didn't do last year, which was to record what decades the books were written in. That's not focused. Oh well. So I decided kind of arbitrarily when I was filling this out at the beginning of the year to count the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And then to also say 1900 to the 1940s or earlier. So those are the categories, and as I was doing this, I was like, maybe these weren't the best ones to pick, but then ultimately it ended up working out, I think. So I read 1 book that was published earlier than 1900, 2 books published between 1900 and 1949, 1 from the 50s, 5 from the 60s, 4 from the 70s, 2 from the 80s, 3 from the 90s, and then 10 from the 2000s and 25 from the 2010s, which means 35 books from the 21st century, which is somewhat more than half. Let's see, that would be 10, this would be 8. Okay, so 35 from the 21st century and 18 from the 20th, which is kind of surprising to me. I thought they were a little more even. I'm thinking they might fall down a little more even this year in 2020, just because I won't be obsessively reading The Expanse, but then again they might not, because I think just as the years progress, I hear more about newer books that I want to read, whereas obviously the number of older books never increases, because duh, that's how time works. And I like reading older books, and I will always keep doing that, but you know, it's probably, well, we'll see. We'll see how it shakes out. All right, so then I have a few more categories. Number of books, or number of authors rather, that were new to me was 22. And number of authors that I've already read was 20, so fairly even. And some of these authors repeated in 2019. And as far as this I think is a complete list. James S. A. Corey, I read like 5 fucking books by that guy this year, maybe 6. L.A. Meyer, who writes the Bloody Jack Adventures. Terry Pratchett. Ellis Peters, who writes the Brother Cadfael mysteries. Isaac Asimov. And Becky Chambers. So that's a fun split. More repeats this year than last year. I think I've been getting a little bit more into reading series, so that's fun. And finally, and possibly the least accurately counted category, because this is the one I tend to kind of forget when it's been months since I've read a book, which is how many of these books contained queer characters. And I said 22. So it might be a little bit lower than what it actually was, but that's almost half, which I think is actually a higher percentage than last year. And that's part of the reason I want to count stuff this year as I go along, so that I don't forget that, because stuff like, have I read this author before? I'm not going to forget, but I might forget if the book had a fairly significant queer character, just because I might forget. So, that's it for those statistics. It's kind of a thing where it's like, do I want to change anything in the future? Not really. I mean, it probably would be good to read a more even split between men and women, but I just don't know if that's going to happen without me attempting to force it to happen, and I don't want to force it to happen. There's plenty of books by women that I really want to read, but given that I tend to read a lot of science fiction, and I don't tend to read... I wonder what the split is like, because I think most of the older books I read are science fiction. Because the way that it sort of works for me is if I read nonfiction, I want it to be within like the last 10 years. Unless it's about unless it's like a memoir, or, you know, maybe some categories of nonfiction that I don't care as much. But largely, if it's nonfiction, especially about a topic I don't know much about, I want it to be a newer book. Because I just feel like it's going to be more accurate, and is also going to have like less, or maybe more awareness of whatever biases might exist in that historical, like, studying. But other categories, like, I don't mind reading older stuff. Like science fiction, I like reading older stuff. Fantasy, I tend to like, I don't know, read newer stuff, because I don't read a lot of fantasy. And the difference between sci-fi and fantasy for me, in terms of interest, is that I think science fiction just has a lot broader base of what I'll read, whereas with fantasy, it's like, there's a lot of older fantasy that I just have zero interest in. Like, a lot of the stuff that's derivative of Lord of the Rings, where Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite things, but then basically anything that's kind of came after it and has the same, like, high fantasy, hero's journey, swords and shit, which, like, isn't even what Lord of the Rings is about, but, you know, people who are bad at interpreting Lord of the Rings and decided Aragorn should have been the main character, you know, that kind of thing, and that's just not interesting to me. However, on the other hand, a lot of the more modern fantasy I hear about on BookTube, especially, it's either YA, which, no, not really, not interested, or it's heavily focused on magic, which, again, not really interested. So, like, fantasy, I'm super picky, but sci-fi I'll read practically anything, so what am I even saying? How did I get on this topic? Help. Oh, right, so sci-fi I'm reading older stuff, fantasy is newer, But sci-fi, I still read newer stuff, and I think that's increasing in the last few years, especially because it used to be that I just plain didn't know much about what was getting published in sci-fi, and so I was reading like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and I still am, but that was like all I was reading, like directly post high school. It was just like I was devouring those books, and slowly over the years I have learned, you know, about a larger pool of science fiction authors, and, you know, also about who's kind of kicking it in the sci-fi worlds today. Okay, let's get back to the fucking topic. Do you like this thing? I got it from Raygun. Vote. Okay, I want them to design some newer I voted stickers, just because I'm like bored of these now, and I have like 4 of them. This is the least relevant thing in the world, I know, but I mean, it's cool that it's got I voted in several different languages on it. I like that it says Cook County on it, because like I got it in Cook County, so duh, but it's boring. All right, now my other categories of things I wanted to talk about here, favorites and whatnot. First, let's start with the like ones that are just plain old stats again. No question. The longest and shortest books. Okay. Now, page count seems to be fairly inaccurate on Goodreads as far as I can tell. Now, maybe I just somehow clicked the wrong edition of every single thing, but it tried to tell me that a number of the Expanse books were like 600 pages, and they're not. They're all like 530 pages. And I was like, what's happening? So, as far as I know, the longest book that Goodreads said I read is not accurate, but the longest book that I think I actually did read was European Travel for the Monstrous Gentlewoman at 720 pages. And like, yeah, the book is that long, and I think it's kind of unnecessary that it's that long, but I did like it, so whatever. And the shortest book, and I believe this is accurate because I own it, was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and that's 183 pages, so it's a little baby book. And another one, oldest, was the one book published before 1900, of course, and that was 2 years before The Mast, which was published in 1840. So that's pretty cool. I think there may be a little confusion, at least for me, as to when the edition I read was published, because it does include a 20 years later bit. But either way, this is the oldest book that I read this year by far. I think the second oldest is probably... Oh, the second oldest was White Fang, which was published in 1906 or something. So, you know, I like to stretch it back there. It's occasionally, very occasionally. All right, now, what was the saddest and funniest books I read this year? Okay, now we're getting into subjective territory. The saddest book, I think, was The Book Thief. That book made me cry a lot. I also should note that I omit nonfiction from a lot of these categories just because I feel like it's kind of unfair. Like, nonfiction is sadder almost inherently just because you're reading about inequality or injustice or horrific events, which actually happened. You're reading The Book Thief and it's like, oh, okay, yes, the Holocaust. Yes, obviously that really happened, but you're reading about people who never existed. So, you know, whatever. The point is, The Book Thief is fucking sad because it's about those things that I just said. And also because it's told from the point of view of death, and every once in a while he'll just be like, by the way, here's how this person dies. And you're like, no, thank you. Don't tell me that. All right, the funniest book, Good Omens. It's probably also the only book I read this year that I would describe as funny. I don't read a lot of funny stuff. Like, I'll read things that makes me laugh occasionally, but, you know, that's kind of not... Like, Good Omens is unquestionably supposed to be funny. Like, the whole plot, everything that it's about is like, yeah, it's the apocalypse, but also it's hilarious. And most of the other things I read will be like, it's funny occasionally for a scene or two, but we're taking the plot pretty seriously. And Good Omens doesn't take anything seriously, so that's an easy winner. All right, most fucked up. This was a hard one this year. Like, last year I had no problem picking, but this year I was like, I read a lot of books with fucked up shit in them. So that's a tough choice, but me from like a month ago when I was answering these questions, I said Catch-22. And I think I stand by that. Like, I could have picked any one of maybe 4 or 5 books, nonfiction, or fiction, of course, not nonfiction, fiction. But Catch-22 is, definitely one of the top contenders. There's just a lot of nonsense in that book, which actually, it occurs to me now, was also sort of a funny book. But it was funny in a more disturbing and cynical way. So, yeah. There's a lot of pretty fucked up stuff that happens in that book, and I think it's kind of interestingly contrasted too by how a lot of the book is very cynical, yes, but it's very like surreal. The way the characters act often doesn't make any kind of logical sense in the same way that you sort of expect. But, then something like will happen and someone's guts are suddenly spilling out of his chest, and you're like, oh, okay. Shit. So, alright, so then finally we're gonna have the categories of my favorite book, my favorite nonfiction book, and my least favorite book. So let's go least favorite first. I picked Tash Hart's Tolstoy. Or is it Tosh? Yeah, Tosh. Tosh Hart's Tolstoy. I did not really like this book. It was the one contemporary I read this year. So, like, yeah, I don't read contemporary for a reason. I tend not to enjoy it, and especially when it's about teenagers, I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. But I read it because it has an asexual main character, and apparently that's enough for me to throw away the logic of maybe you shouldn't read contemporary because you don't really like it, to read one and then be like, yeah, confirmed, I don't really like it. I don't even think it's a bad book. It's just not my thing at all, and I just didn't really care about the characters, and I didn't care that much about the plot, such as it was, and I didn't really enjoy reading about an asexual character who is... she's very unsure of herself, but in a way that I didn't like reading about, really, which, I mean, obviously that's probably fairly accurate for a lot of people, but I'm still kind of like, oh god. So that was sort of tough. Yeah, I didn't love it. Didn't love it. And I liked most of the stuff I read this year, of course, so it's always a little bit difficult to pick a least favorite, but usually there's a few books where I'll go, oh yeah, I didn't really like that so much, and this was the winner. Okay, so then we have favorite fiction versus favorite nonfiction. Favorite nonfiction was The 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. So, okay, so it's like, it's favorite. And I rate things on Goodreads based on how much I enjoy them, not necessarily the relative quality that I feel they have. I would say I think the best nonfiction book I read this year was The Color of Law. But, like, 7 Pillars of Wisdom was a lot of fun to read, my guys. I just really had a blast with it, and I am not recommending that anybody else read it, necessarily, because I think the reason I liked it so much is because in January or February, my brain was like, what if T.E. Lawrence was just a thing we were obsessed with for a couple of weeks? And I was like, well, alright. And that made reading the book really fun. There are large swaths of the book that are pretty dull, but there are parts that are really interesting, and there are parts that are very disturbing. I would say that it has this one chapter. So if you'll recall in the movie, if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, there's a section of the movie where he gets captured by a Turkish, military governor or something, and he gets whipped, and it's pretty harrowing, but in the book it is like way worse. And I read that chapter, and despite knowing it was coming, I had to put the book down and not read for several days. I was just like, no, we gotta recover from this, because wow, that's some bad shit. And yeah, but there were also parts I found were really funny. There was a lot of stuff about camels that was really funny. I don't know, I just really enjoyed it, and yeah. It's kind of a niche thing, I think, but there you go. And my favorite book, I'm gonna totally cheat here, I couldn't pick, and I'm just gonna say that my favorite book this year was The Expanse, which is not a book, it's a series, but it was a really good series. And I just really liked it. So, I feel like that's all I've talked about this year is The Expanse. Every month or every other month, it's been like, I read another book, and it was fantastic, and guess what? I read book 8 in 2020. I just finished it, like, yesterday, and it was fantastic, so stay tuned. But, I just really love that series, and I think it's gotten me back into wanting to read science fiction series, which I hadn't done for quite a while, and series in general, because I'd kind of been avoiding them, because I didn't want to commit myself, but, like, series are fun. They're fun. Oh yeah, love it. All right. Let's talk about 2020 reading goals such as they are. And also talk about what my 2019 reading goals were such as they were. They were very minimal. I just had a handful of science fiction authors I wanted to read more of, and like mostly didn't. I did read one more book by Philip K. Dick. So I count that as a win, but the other ones I kind of didn't do. Oops. And then the other thing was I had that reading challenge that wasn't really framed as a 2019 thing, but it was mostly a 2019 thing. And that was when I picked books out of a mug to read them. They were all books that I owned. So I read like 7 of them. You know, so I didn't really succeed, but I went through, I went through basically through August, and then I kind of got tired of it and just hit some books I didn't care that much about. I mean, it got me to finally read Seven Pillars of Wisdom and a couple of other things that I ended up quite enjoying. So I counted a win in that department, but I wanted to have a challenge this year that will hopefully be more successful. Basically, I thought one of the issues with picking books out of a jar is that it means that even if I'm not interested in reading that book at that moment, I have to read it now before I can move on, and that sucks. And I see other people doing this kind of challenge, so I thought I would give it a try, where you pick a certain number of books that you want to read and make a list of them, and so I have. So this is my 20 books to read in 2020 list. And I know, focus on me. I know that the kind of the game, I guess, as I've seen older videos, was to kind of read, 19 books in 2019, 18 books I want to read in 2018, but that's obviously unsustainable for long term. You can't just keep adding another book to the list, and like at some point you're going to hit a number that's just too big. So I think 20 is a nice round even number. I think it's fair. It's less than half of what I would read in a year, provided I can keep up my kind of pace that I've had for the last couple of years. And I'm not going to pick them out of a jar or anything. Like, I like watching videos where people do that, but I just don't think it'll work for me. I'm just going to have the list. Okay, so I'm going to go through all 20 of these books. I'll try to keep it snappy if I'm even physically capable of that. But I put them on for a number of different reasons. I own some of them. I have a bunch of nonfiction ones on here. Some of them are books that are part of series that I've been reading, so like I was going to read them anyway, but I wanted to give myself some kind of easy points. And some are the beginnings of series I've been kind of neglecting, and a couple of them are books that I wanted to read because of some queer character that is in it, and I'm into that. So, let's go. So, first we have some nonfictions. We have Quantum by Manjeet Kumar, which is about quantum physics and the sort of the fight between Einstein and Bohr over whether quantum physics was like valid. Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin, which is something to do with the history of Chicago. I don't really remember exactly what, but I want to read it. Moon Boots and Dinner Suits by Jon Pertwee. Jon Pertwee was the third person to play the Doctor on Doctor Who, and this is his autobiography, and my sister got it for me for Christmas, and I'm super excited. A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, which, like, you've heard of. The Mint by T.E. Lawrence. So that's the other book that T.E. Lawrence, writer of Seven Pillars of Wisdom, wrote. It's about his time in the RAF post-World War I. And then Isaac's Storm by Erik Larson. And I've read in the past years almost all the books by Erik Larson that I want to read, except this one. And it's about the Galveston hurricane of 1904 or something like that, like super early 20th century. So those are all the nonfiction. Then we get into some science fiction, and it's a little bit, okay. Dragon's Egg by Robert L. Forward. This one is the book that has been on my Goodreads TBR shelf the longest. And I was like, bitch, you want to read it sometime this century? It's been on there since like 2011, I think, which is absurd. So then we've got The Robots of Dawn by Isaac Asimov, which is the third book in the Robots trilogy, and I was planning on reading it this year, so I put it on here. Then we have This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. And this is a book that I think was published like a couple of months ago max, and I'm really curious about it. Like, apparently the story is about two people fighting on opposite sides of a time war, and they fall in love. And also I think it's told through letters, so don't know how much of that's accurate, but it sounds really interesting. Then Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. This is the beginning of a sci-fi trilogy. My vague understanding is that it's about a person who was a spaceship. So I'm super curious. And then The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, which is something that I've been intending to read some years ago, but I just like didn't. I think I checked it out from the library and then never read it. And I want to read something by Bester. And then a Star Trek book, Enigma Tales by Una McCormick, which is something my sister got me a couple of years ago for Christmas that I somehow still haven't read, even though it's a fucking Star Trek book. So like, we're gonna do this. Alright, then we get into some books that are on here because of queer characters. Whole Metal Girls by Emily Skritsky. I think that's kind of a sci-fi thing. I think there's an asexual character. That's kind of all I remember. I put it on my list at some point, and I'm like, okay. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Now that's supposed to be a retelling of the story of Achilles and Patroclus, who were fighting in the Iliad, like they're in the Iliad. Fighting in the Iliad. It's like, the Iliad's not the name of the war, idiot. Okay. They're characters from the Iliad. They're in love. It's gonna be tragic as fuck. Alright, How to Be a Normal Person by TJ Klune. I like legit don't remember anything about what this book is supposed to be about because it's been on my shelf forever, but there's an asexual character. I'm sold. Then we've got The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy by Mackenzie Lee. This last year I read The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, and I loved it, and I want to read its sequel, which focuses on his little sister Felicity, who was asexual, so like I'm into it. Okay, so then we have just kind of 4 books at the end of the list that honestly don't fit into any of the other categories as well. They're just on here. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is the beginning of the Broken Earth trilogy, right? And this is the one where it won the Hugo 3 years in a row. Like, it's insane, right? I want to know what this is about. I want to know, you know, I want to know how good it is. I'm super excited. I think it's kind of fantasy, and it is about like a world where the climate is all fucked up and there's earthquakes and stuff, and there's people with magic abilities to control it, I think. Okay, then Babylon Berlin by Volker Kutscher, which I watched the TV show Babylon Berlin on Netflix, I think about a year ago, and I loved it, and I was like obsessed. It's a German TV show based on these books, 4 of which have been translated into English, so I really want to know what the heck, but they're set during the 1920s, and they're about a detective, and this is taking long enough, I don't need to describe it. If I read it, you'll find out. In the Miso Soup by Ryu Murakami. This one I got off a list of just like really short thrillers and crime novels, and it just sounded really intriguing. Apparently it's about a tour guide type character who is in, I think, Shanghai, but that might be incorrect. And he's showing a tourist around to, you know, some like seedy kind of places, because that's just his job. And he begins to suspect that this man might be a notorious serial killer who has been haunting the district recently. So I'm super intrigued by that. And finally, Evil at Heart by Chelsea Cain, which is the third book in the thriller series about the detective Archie Sheridan and the serial killer Gretchen Gretchen Lowell. I always want to see Gretchen Wieners. It's a problem. Gretchen Lowell. And I don't know that the series has a proper, like, overarching title, so I just kind of am like, that one. But anyway, this is another book I was planning on reading in any case, so it's on here. And that's it. That's the 20. I'm hoping to read all of these books this year, and if I don't, I'm not gonna like punish myself. It's just probably if I do this again next year, the book, whatever book I don't read this year, will be on that list. So it's within my best interest to read them all, because then I can have a great fresh start in 2021. Oh my God, 2021. Let's not even talk about it. Let's not even think about it. All right. Jesus fuck. I think we're done here. I think that is more than enough. Thank you and good night.